Hey, good to be with you. You should always pay close attention when a deeply strange phrase becomes normalized. You remember 8 years ago, trillion became normalized. Trillion was a word that, until United States debt started rampaging out of control, was a word that was only applied to astronomy. Such a planet was so many trillion light years from Earth. That was the only activity in which you needed the word trillion. When you need trillion for government budgeting, you got a big problem. Pay close attention when a deeply weird word, a word that should stay abnormal, becomes normalized. When I was saying something similar with the phrase deep state, have you heard about the deep state? Ooh, the deep state, the deep state, the deep state. The deep state used to be something that was believed in only by conspiracy theorists, and occasionally it would percolate into the kind of conspiracy thrillers you see, where some guy is on the lam in a car and the spooks at the CIA in Washington are out to get him, and the car pulls into a little nothing town in the middle of the Kansas cornfields all around. It's a one stoplight burg, and there's a faded old general store with a payphone outside, and he thinks, oh, it's just about safe here. I've got a quarter, I can make that one call. And he steps into the payphone and he drops his quarter in the payphone and he starts to make the call, and somewhere back at the CIA headquarters in Washington, a spook gives an order and pew, the payphone is vaporized and the deep state has got him. And the deep state doesn't need to vaporize payphones anymore because they're kind of few and far between. If they wanted to vaporize payphones, there's only 7 left in America, so they could do it very easily. But instead, they've moved on to a rather more public kind of vaporizing, in which they have determined that the President of the United States and members of his administration are their enemy, and they're going to get them. And they've just vaporized Mike Flynn, the National Security Advisor, which is quite a coup, because the National Security Advisor is supposed to be in the loop on all the deep state national security activities. So we live in a very strange kind of environment, where on the left, for example, they're actively urging military coups. They're actively urging a 9 days in May scenario, a movie we talked about on this show a few weeks ago, where a cabal of generals conspired to overthrow the legitimate government of the United States. The left is now agitating for that. They'd rather have a coup of generals than Donald Trump. They'd rather the spooks overthrew the state, because they'd rather have a cabal of CIA operatives whose names they don't even know, determining who gets to stay in government or not. And the right, a certain faction on the right is hot for it too. Bill Kristol, you recall, was the editor of the Weekly Standard and the numero uno of the Never Trumpers. He was always trying to find a candidate to run against Trump. He was never Trump to the end. I've known Bill Kristol for a few years, always had very pleasant interactions with him. But he went slightly off the rails, I would say, during the election campaign. He met somewhere on an island, I think, off South Carolina or somewhere. He flew in all the big shot Never Trumpers, and they had the equivalent of the Spectre board meeting in a James Bond film. You know, when Blofeld, you see it in the film Spectre, when Blofeld finds an exotic location and calls in everybody for the Spectre board meeting to discuss their plans for world domination. And Bill Kristol held a Spectre board meeting where they were going to decide who was going to be the guy who was going to take out Trump for them, just like Blofeld and Spectre decide who's going to take out James Bond. And I made a joke about that on the radio at the time he held his Spectre board meeting. It seems to have gone to his head. He actually thinks he is Blofeld now. This is what Bill Kristol tweeted on Valentine's Day after Mike Flynn had been taken out by leaks made by people deep within, quotes, the intelligence community. Here's Bill Kristol's tweet. obviously strongly prefer normal democratic and constitutional politics, but if it comes to it, I prefer the deep state to the Trump state. So he'd rather be governed by shadowy CIA operatives manipulating people in the shadows than by legitimately elected representatives of the American people. And I thought that was just Bill warming up to his kind of Blofeld Spectre image. But no, here we are, story from the Wall Street Journal. Spies keep intelligence from Donald Trump on leak concerns. Decision to withhold information underscores deep mistrust between intelligence community and president. And this story is interesting. US intelligence officials have withheld sensitive intelligence from President Donald Trump because they are concerned it could be leaked or compromised, according to current and former officials familiar with the matter. Okay, let's just break down what that means. They're so concerned that Trump could leak intelligence that they're leaking intelligence against Trump. The officials' decision to keep information from Mr. Trump underscores the deep mistrust that has developed between the intelligence community and the president over his team's contacts with the Russian government, as well as the enmity he has shown toward US spy agencies. Okay, the enmity he has shown toward US spy agencies. In other words, because he's made some remarks about US spy agencies, they're leaking against him. By the way, let's just forget this Russian stuff. And put it to one side. If you want to think this is something to do with Trump leaking to the Russians, here's what happened. December 29th, almost 2 months after Trump won the election, he'd said that Michael Flynn was going to be his national security advisor. And the national security advisor has a phone conversation with the Russian ambassador. And the, quote, intelligence community, unquote, happens to have a recording of that telephone conversation. Which is interesting. You know, they're recording the Russian ambassador, and we know this kind of thing goes on. The Germans will record the US ambassador. The British will record the Russian ambassador. This goes on in all kinds of countries all over the place. You have to go to some effort and art if you want to have a conversation that isn't recorded. But they recorded this conversation, and then they leaked the fact that they'd recorded this conversation to damage not the foreigner they're eavesdropping on, but the American they're eavesdropping on. And if this conversation is so compromising and so damaging, this phone conversation of December 29th, that they have now used to take out, to vaporize Trump's national security advisor, then let's hear it. Let's see it. Let's see the transcript. Let's hear the conversation. Let's judge it for ourselves. At the moment, we are living in an insane scenario in which people who profess to be social justice warriors or hardcore leftists or moderate right of center are all cheering on the spooks hollowing out the integrity of American government. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories about this. According to the Washington Free Beacon, for example, Obama holdovers had plotted to undermine Trump's national security plans even before he set foot in the White House. The abrupt resignation Monday evening of White House National Security Advisor Michael Flynn is the culmination of a secret months-long campaign by former Obama administration confidants to handicap President Donald Trump's national security apparatus and preserve the nuclear deal with Iran. So do you follow this? We've had an election, and elections have consequences. Because under the constitutional order of free societies, people go along to voting booths and they vote for the political platform they prefer. And one guy loses and the other guy wins. And the guy who wins gets to implement his program. In free societies, that's how it works. In this society, the, quote, intelligence community, unquote, has decided that it's not on board with this and that it wishes to subvert the wishes of the people expressed through the normal Republican voting procedures that have prevailed in this country for over 2 centuries. That ought to be the story here. That ought to be the story. Instead, Chuck Schumer warned very presciently just a few weeks ago that Trump was picking a fight he could only lose by objecting to the intelligence community's leaking against him, because you don't want to make an enemy of the intelligence community, he said, because they can get the goods on you. You know, nice little government you got here. You wouldn't want anything to happen to it, would you? And lo and behold, Chuck Schumer issues this threat. And Chuck Schumer's right. In an electronic age, they can get the goods on anyone. They can get the goods on you. They can get into your computer and see if you've got kiddie porn in there. And if you haven't got kiddie porn in there, they can put it in there for you. That's what these guys can do. And that's what they're now doing openly. And there's something to be said for spooks getting the goods on people if they're doing it in the shadows and it's all behind the scenes. But there's something weird about living in a country where they're doing it openly and they're being cheered on. And as I said, I keep saying, quote, the intelligence community, unquote. There are officially 16 intelligence agencies. I think that's the number. There may be another one along in a minute. It's like the number 23 bus. In America, you can never have enough intelligence agencies. Most countries manage to make do with 2. They'll have a domestic one and they'll have an overseas one. In Britain, they have MI5 and MI6. And it's a small community, the intelligence community. Yes, it's a community in the sense that it's a relatively small community. I mentioned Spectre. The point about James Bond is that he's 007, License to Kill. 007, it's a very low number because there aren't meant to be a lot of these people. The last time they ran a count on this, I think there were over 4 million people in the United States with top security clearances. That's the entire population of New Zealand just employed as spooks with top security clearances. So it's not 007 here, it's 004, well, it's 400000000 and 7. There's no end to them. There's millions and millions of these people. And they're not spooks in the sense that they're rappelling down the walls of the strongman's palace in some godforsaken, ramshackle corner of the globe to get their guy out of there and prevent the communists putting their guy in. They don't do that kind of stuff very well. The, quote, intelligence community, unquote, in the United States has got every single thing that mattered in the last few decades, whether it's the fall of the Soviet Union or Pakistan becoming a nuclear power. Wrong. Wrong. And the left used to have fun with that. The left, for example, were happy to use the total screw-up of the intelligence community about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. They basically used that single mistake by America's inept intelligence community against George W. Bush to destroy his presidency. Now we have the intelligence community, the deep state, taking it to the next level and actually picking off cabinet officers it's decided do not serve its interests. So we have an intelligence community that is meant to protect America's interests overseas, around the globe, and it's entirely useless on that front. It can't get a guy into ISIS, it can't get a guy into Al-Qaeda. It knows, it's basically, the CIA are tourists in the heart of darkness when they're out in the Middle East or the Hindu Kush. They're useless for that. But they're apparently brilliant at getting the goods on you and ensuring that you don't become a cabinet officer of the United States government. And that's what they did to Mike Flynn. And they're openly leaking about it. They're leaking against the president. They're leaking. What's interesting about this Wall Street Journal story, spies keep intelligence from Donald Trump on leak concerns. Decision to withhold info, and that's not concerns about their leaking, because as I said, they're leaking against the president. They're doing that on an industrial scale now. We have an intelligence community that's supposed to live in the shadows and guard its secrets, and it's turned into the Niagara Falls of leaks. It's leaking like a gusher across the newspapers, across the front pages, every day. Spies keep intelligence from Donald Trump on leak concerns, not their leak concerns, their concerns that he'll leak the stuff. They're so concerned about the stuff he'll be leaking to other people that they're leaking to the papers that they don't want him leaking to other people. That's part of the wilderness of mirrors, to use the old spy phrase, that we're living in now, where the spooks are leaking against the politicians over fears that the politicians might leak against the spooks. So the spooks are leaking against the politicians first. And that's all very cute, except for the reality here, which is that the spooks are supposed to work for the people's representatives. And just as we have civilian control of the military in free societies, so too we have civilian control of the intelligence agencies. I said officially there were 16. There are undoubtedly, in fact, more than that, because there are all these other ones that we don't know about that are so secret they can't even be revealed. But it is an interesting development in the panopticon state, which can see everything you do. And this has been developing over the years simply as a function of technology. But in political terms, it was greatly accelerated by 9/11, to the point, for example, where the front of every letter that is mailed through the US mail, just to take a quaint non-cutting edge technology, is actually scanned and photographed. So there's a record of that. So if your grandma sends you a nice hand-knitted sweater for Christmas, and you don't really like it, but you put it on Christmas morning and everyone laughs at you, and your mom takes a picture of you wearing the hideous Christmas sweater, and then you send a nice little polite thank you note to grandma saying, thank you for the lovely sweater, I haven't stopped wearing it, I'm going to wear it every day. The front of that envelope with the thank you note to your grandma is scanned and stored by the United States government. And that's just nothing stuff. As we now know, they're also recording every email, and they're also recording phone calls. And the concern about this from libertarians when it came up was that the government would use this information against the people. What's happening instead is something that in a way is even more disturbing because it makes legitimate government impossible. The people who collect this information are using the information they collect against the government. And in a sense, they're making government impossible, which is why forcing Mike Flynn out is not a small thing. You know, when John Roberts twisted himself into a pretzel to find a way to justify, in constitutional terms, Obamacare, people couldn't quite figure out why the Chief Justice would do something like this. And the reason they gave was that obviously the spooks had the goods on him. They'd obviously tracked his emails, and they'd tapped his phone, and they'd found something in there that necessitated him twisting himself into a pretzel and issuing this nonsense opinion legitimizing Obamacare. And I didn't pay too much attention to that at the time. I tended to take Chief Justice Roberts' word view for it the view that was attributed to him, that he thought it would damage the court, were the court to actually stand and face down the government on a core part of its policy, that it would in fact help delegitimize the court. I thought that was, on balance, the more likely explanation. But the Roberts scenario has just happened. Essentially, a man has been removed because of something that we, the people, to use the first words in the American ideal, the words that distinguish the American constitutional order from traditional constitutional orders where the monarch is sovereign. Here it's supposed to be we the people. And the people have been entirely cut out of the conversation. This is some all-time great pissing match between some faction of the spooks and the representatives of the people. And I want to see if that transcript of Flynn's conversation with the Russian ambassador is so damaging, then let's see it so that we, the people, can be part of this conversation. Right now, as I said, it's a pissing match between the spooks and the government, and all we can see is the cascade of urine. We don't even know whose penis it belongs to. Again, this is a strange and bizarre evolution, even in traditional political infighting. Because what the spooks are basically saying is that there's no due process, there's no right to defend yourself, there's no pushback. The employees, minor functionaries of the government bureaucracy, can leak anonymously against the popularly elected government, and without anybody appending names to those leaks or knowing the validity of those leaks, they can utterly destroy you. And as I said, I don't know why Bill Kristol is going along with it, because I don't actually think it's that funny. I think if they get away with it, they're going to do it more often. And in the end, we'll all have kiddie porn on our computers because they'll be able to get the goods on anybody. And once people understand that they can get the goods on you, and they don't even need the goods because they can put the goods there, then essentially you will have an uncontrollable faction somewhere deep in the bowels of the government, in an agency, in a branch of an agency whose name isn't even known, that will be able to pull this stuff off all the time. It's strange to me how respectable, as I said, Bill Kristol, the never Trump thing, you know, he went for it 100%. He wasn't one of these never Trumpers who was never Trump, never Trump, never Trump, and then put the finger in the wind and changed their position 6 weeks before the election. He was never Trump to the end, and nobody cared. It didn't work for him. Stalin's famous line about the Vatican, how many divisions has the Pope? In the end, that was the question for Bill Kristol. How many divisions has Bill Kristol? He didn't have any. He lost, and he had a very bad election. And I can understand, in a way, why his response to that would be to double down on insanity and say he'd prefer to be governed by a bunch of shadowy, anonymous spooks rather than the people's representatives. But respectable opinion is slightly different. The respectable left, the Atlantic, are deep state leakers defending democracy or corroding it? In what sense are they defending democracy? In what sense are they defending democracy? An election was held. The election was fair. You don't like the result. That's the definition of, quote, democracy. Your guy doesn't win and you accept it. The minute your guy doesn't win and you don't accept it, that's no longer democracy. That's some crazy banana republic where when the wrong guy wins the election and gets in the presidential palace, you grab your machete and you hack all his supporters to bit. The definition of democracy is the guy you don't like wins and you accept it. But the Atlantic is musing, are deep state leakers defending democracy or corroding it? The fact that they can ask that question as if it's a reasonable question. These spooks are not defending democracy. They're defending entrenched power, entrenched elite power against the people's representatives. And I preferred, it's hard to find a principled lefty these days, but Will Bunch in the Philadelphia Daily News is one such. And the headline in the Philly Daily News is this: the people need to take down Trump, not the deep state. Will Bunch is a very old-fashioned leftist these days. He's still going around doing the people united shall never be defeated. He's still talking about the proletariat. The peasants are revolting. And if it comes to it, I will take a man who demands that the peasants revolt and rise up against their rulers than a cynical, rotted-out world in which we have to accept that the peasants' elected representatives are simply puppets and tools of a permanent shadow state run by people whose names we do not even know. I have a line that I've used for years. It's in my book, After America. After America. You might like to buy that book. That title might be more relevant than you think if these guys keep carrying on like this. I have a line in there talking about what has happened to the Western world since the end of the Second World War. You don't need a president for life if you've got a bureaucracy for life. And you don't need a president at all if you've got a, quote, intelligence community, unquote, for life. I am in favor of a smaller, more efficient, more effective intelligence community, and one that focuses on destroying America's enemies rather than the president's legitimate choices to serve in his administration. We'll see you next time.